what a lot of people don't realize is that the internet exists because of LSD. You know, um, when LSD was starting to be used in clinical trials at Stanford, there's a gentleman by the name of Ken Kesey who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who was an early experimenter in those Stanford clinical trials, snuck out a bunch of acid and distributed it all over Palo Alto, which then became Silicon Valley. And you look at people who were very involved. I mean, Steve Jobs is the most famous one, but there's a lot of other people who were involved with the computer revolution and the internet revolution that were heavily influenced in their approach by the use of LSD. Stuart Brand is another really interesting guy who's still alive today, and has talked pretty openly about his own experiences with LSD and the computer and all that. So I think that's like the starting base, right? Because so much of the education that's available today is done through the internet, whereas in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the government could propagandize whatever they wanted to through the educational system. But today, there's a lot more autonomy that people have over their capacity to discover what's real and what's not. And so education, knowing, the difference between ketamine and MDMA, understanding that psychedelics, although they are Schedule I substances, are actually not addictive, I think is a huge part. Understanding that, psychedelics are very different than SSRIs in terms of how they interact with the brain and the impact that they have on people is an important one. I think recognizing the value and utility of these indigenous practices, right? That we don't just get too occupied with synthetics or modern medicine, but that we recognize that there's a history, there's a context in which a lot of these plant medicines have come from, and that to stay in right relationship with them, there needs to be some level of reciprocity or relationship to where these medicines come from, which in most cases is Central and South America. Not all cases, but in many cases is Central and South America. So I think just that like basic level education, right? I call it psychedelic literacy or the skill of psychedelics. So, just like everyone should learn how to cook their own eggs or, make their own toast, or everyone should learn, how to read and write as these basic skills. I think knowing the difference between a psychedelic and heroin is important. Or I think knowing that psychedelics are medically useful is important. Or I think knowing that psychedelics have a long, long history of use in various indigenous communities around the globe is important. And as long as we can get most people there, recognizing the utility, understanding some of the research around it, I think that's good. I saw in a recent poll that Cal Berkeley had done that over 70% of Americans now support legal psychedelic therapy, right? So we're definitely at a point where there's been a lot of media, there's been a lot of attention around this. Colorado, Oregon, New Mexico have legalized psilocybin. The FDA recently announced that they may approve synthetic psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression by the end of this year, right? So there's a lot of momentum and movement. And education isn't everything, right? Because after education comes providers. And I think that's another key and important aspect is, okay, if you're learning about this, great, but who are you going to go do this with? In what context are you going to do this? In which medicine are you going to use? And I think that's then the next big phase of this sort of third wave of psychedelics. If the last 10 years was really focused on education, which we seem to have won, I think it's going quite well. I think the next 10 years, and how do you train up potentially thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of practitioners and how to work with psychedelics, because the ability to work with psychedelics is much different than standard CBT psychotherapy or, a 15-minute psychiatric appointment or, taking an SSRI every day and managing symptoms. It's a whole new landscape and a whole new ball game. And most people don't themselves as practitioners have the experience, know-how, and nervous system capacity to hold that for others.
Yeah. Let's talk about your own experiences with psychedelics. In one of the podcasts, you said that ayahuasca helped you overcome weed addiction. Can you talk to us about that and just maybe addiction in general?
Yeah, I mean, there's what I love about psychedelics is they're not really all that sticky.